No matter how cybercrime evolves, one thing remains constant. Humans are the weak point in cybersecurity. Social engineers continue to adapt and change their tactics in order to stay one step ahead of employees. On today's Cyber Chat, we talk with Kevin Epstein, Vice President of Proofpoint's Threat Operations Center. Proofpoint just released their Human Factor 2016 report, and Kevin took some time out from RSA to chat about the report, trends in phishing, and how cybercriminals continue to exploit the human factor to circumvent cybersecurity. I always enjoy every year reading the Proofpoint Human Factor report because it's always interesting to see how these social engineering threats are evolving. So I guess first I wanted to get your kind of high-level take on the year in general. In the report it said that in 2015, people replaced exploits as attackers' favorite way to beat cybersecurity. Is that, I guess, the headline you'd want everyone to take away from the report?
Absolutely. And again, this isn't to say that sophisticated technical exploits went away, and sometimes they were used in conjunction with social engineering. But the net single line takeaway is that, as the show Mr. Robot says, people make the best exploits. We, as a collective group of human beings, turn out to be fighting against thousands of years of evolution where curiosity was a helpful thing, and training us not to be curious, not to click, not to follow links, not to open attachments, turns out not to be something you can do 100% of the time, with the result that attackers have leveraged that, have realized that that's something they can exploit.
Was there anything that surprised you, or was it kind of a continuation of evolutions that you've seen over the past couple of years in terms of phishing and social engineering?
It was extremely surprising, actually, because we've always seen some degree of social engineering, but the radical shift this year accompanied a shift from URL-based attacks and drive-by downloads towards attachments, which took off largely driven by Dridex. And it was really evident that attackers had stumbled across, through trial and error, a formula that cost them less in research dollars, but appears to be reaping similar rewards if you believe the FBI reports on the $1.2 billion lost to business email compromise.
Yeah, I know in the report you kind of divided it into 3 different categories, so I thought maybe we could run down each one. The first one, you guys talked about high-volume spam attacks. Is there anything interesting that changed there in 2015?
So there are similarities and differences. The most important similarity is that email is still the number one vector, and people still click. And again, socially, attackers know this. The highest risk time is Tuesday mornings between 7 and 10 a.m. local business hours. And that's when you're most likely to receive attacks. The biggest difference from an email vector standpoint was that, again, we saw a definitive shift from URL-based attacks, which used to be in the majority. Those volumes stayed about stable, but then attachment-driven attacks, typically Word documents with embedded macros, went up by a multiple factor. And again, that's largely driven by the Dridex actors distributing Dridex and then later Locky ransomware.
Yeah, it surprised me how much of or I think wasn't it like 75% of the banking Trojans you guys saw was Dridex? That was pretty high, I thought.
Oh, yes. No, absolutely. The Dridex actors, and one can hypothesize about the motives, largely financial, but it was very clear that if you watch the patterns prior to the end of summer, so in the beginning of the year, Dridex actors were the most active, but their campaigns were still in the sub-million range up through August, when their person who's allegedly their primary spam distributor was arrested. And we saw a 30-day almost complete cessation of activity. And then they must have hired their new middle person because we saw a resumption in Dridex. And then in the latter part of the year, there was an abortive takedown attempt of a Dridex botnet in sort of the October-November timeframe. And it was quite evident that immediately following, 24 hours following that takedown attempt, there was a doubling or tripling in Dridex volume that set of attackers was fairly clearly announcing to the world that the takedown attempt had failed. They were stronger than ever. And unfortunately, the evidence suggests that they had been remaining stealthy in the tradition of email attacks, trying to stay relatively low volume, and that in this larger attack, they still received similar response rates, at which point, if you get a 2% click-through, regardless of whether you send 100 emails or 1 million emails, well, what are you going to send?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If it makes money, do it, as there appears to be their informal motto.
Yeah, and then in the medium volume attacks that you guys wrote about in the report, you said that people were basically running the attacker's code for them, rather than these automated exploits. We're seeing a lot more involvement of the users. What different ways are cybercriminals using in order to kind of carry that out?
So you're absolutely right. In the spirit of the old TV show, we are the weakest link. The simplest approach is the classic, hey, there's an invoice attached or a resume attached, some Word document attached. You double-click open the document, and the document will have a blurred image in it, or just a simple set of instructions that say this document has been encrypted with a bunch of gibberish below it. To unblur the image or to unencrypt the document for your security protection, please click the Enable Macros button above.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a certain degree of irony in that the attackers are invoking people's security concerns to trick you into circumventing the built-in security protections in your computer. Similarly, in mobile devices and in social networks, again, similar tactics where it's just click here to accept the certificate on your mobile device and let the app do what it wants.
Mm-hmm. I know people were kind of surprised when all these malicious macro attacks kind of came back, I think like a year or two ago. But you guys are still seeing those happen a lot in 2015 then? They're not going away?
Oh, absolutely not. They are larger than ever. And that is, in fact, where the line is crossed between technical sophistication and lack thereof. Because these are not, this is not your father's Oldsmobile. These are not the old guard classic, fairly simple macro attacks. These are multi-stage payloads. So the initial macro may do something fairly innocuous, but that then leverages something else to create downloads of more dangerous things. They blend classic 419 scams with malware. So one of the more sophisticated, simultaneously less sophisticated, more sophisticated attacks we've seen is where the embedded macro doesn't do anything that is directly malicious. All it does is install a local Outlook rule on your copy of Outlook, changing the reply to address for one of your officers, your CEO, your CFO, to a slightly different typo squat email address. In that scenario, the next time you reply to a real email from your real official, the reply will go to someone else who is not that person. Again, classic 419 scam, typically credited to Nigerian actors. And then the person in the middle will forward the email communications. So you end up unknowingly going on for sometimes weeks, chatting normal communications with your officer. And at some point in that communication, the man in the middle will insert a paragraph asking you to transfer money or commit some other act.
Mm-hmm. So
it's social engineering, clearly, but it also involved penetration by a Trojan-carrying device that, you could argue Trojan malware, but a piece of malicious code that did something fairly subtle with your assistance.
I wanted to also ask you about just what happened in social media and mobile phones. People, I guess people have been talking about that for a couple years, and you guys had a few sections in the report on that. I guess my question is, how do people defend against that? Because, now there's just so many more avenues and vectors for people to do these attacks. Is there any advice you have for organizations out there?
So again, it's one of those horrible statements where email is the leading vector, but social and mobile are arguably the fastest growing vector. Mobile particularly because in most cases, MDM much like SPF and DKIM for email, MDM will tell you what apps you are allowed to run, but not whether those apps are in fact compromised. But the basic advice remains the same across all of these vectors. Don't succumb to the obvious. And let me give two specific examples. In social media, never reply with an account number or PIN code or anything similarly private across social media channels. We've seen multiple instances where folks are tweeting or going via Facebook to talk to a customer service group for a major entity. At some point, perhaps when the major entity's customer service shuts down for the day or they're transitioning shifts, a similarly handled, so almost the same name, same logo, tweet will come back or Facebook contact will come back from someone who's actually an attacker masquerading as customer service and will ask you for your PIN code or account numbers or so forth. No one should be asking for that. That's a common communication. No one should be asking for that. The big warning sign right there. Similarly, in mobile apps, there are official app stores set up. There are screening processes in place in those app stores. You are far less likely to get compromised apps from a known app store with a known publisher with several million reviews whose website you can go check out on the side and be sure they're legitimate, than if you go to a unknown or unofficial app store. They claim to have an app that's on the main app store for less or for free. Maybe the publisher is someone you don't know. These again, if you're the type of person who likes to buy goods on the street that fell off the back of a truck, well, they carry similar cyber risks.
The last section in the report, you guys talked about the more low volume targeted attacks. And I remember when I spoke to you last year, we talked a little bit about how the shift was more of a shift towards these corporate accounts. And I think you called it tuna phishing back then.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because that's been one of the big stories that we've talked about on this podcast a lot this year is the rise of these business email compromises. Can you just maybe explain a little bit how that works and what you guys found there?
Absolutely. So the irony again is that which is old is new. 10 years ago, people would see the email from the grieving widow who had millions of dollars in a foreign country locked up, and all they needed from you was a bank account number and maybe a small fee to cover the wire transfer. The effectively same message is coming through, only now it's people receiving an email that purports to be from an officer of their company. Sometimes it's a spoofed email address. Sometimes it's an email address with one or two letters changed or a one used in placement I. So similar. Sometimes it claims to be from the executive's personal account. So that explains the public IP address and an email address. But regardless, it's a command that claims that the executive is in a hurry and needs the recipient to quickly transfer some large sum of money somewhere else. And people do this repeatedly. And in fact, in the most recent waves, we've now seen similar requests, but instead of financial transfers, because those are becoming well publicized, we're seeing requests going into human resources for employees' W-2 forms or validation or verification. So now we're beginning to see PII breaches inadvertently committed by human resources as opposed to direct financial transfers committed by finance groups. Scary either way.
Looking forward, kind of to the coming year, is there any, I don't know if you have any predictions or if you want to go out on a limb with that, or anything that stands out to you that you think businesses should be aware of when it comes to this?
So sad to say, the predictions are don't require the great Karnak or a great crystal ball here. It's going to continue. The fact is that the vast majority of attacks we see are not cyber espionage. They are not hacktivism. They are very straightforward cybercrime for the purposes of financial gain. And as long as the money is still there, again, to quote Willie Sutton, early 1800s or 1900s bank robber, said, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. We will continue to see attacks on large enterprises. using social engineering because people are hardwired to respond in certain ways, and it's hard to get everyone to overcome that all the time. And we will continue to see losses, and that's why, from a defensive posture standpoint, modern defenses must assume that some small percentage of penetration will occur because the volumes of these attacks are so huge, some percent of email or social will get through. And they must assume that some percent of people will click. And consequently, defensive systems should be built accordingly, looking at clicks at click time all the time, containing mechanisms to rapidly identify incursions and kick people off the network so that the penetration can't spread laterally. We've left an era of perimeter-only defenses, and we're clearly in a post-perimeter era where this has to be thought of holistically and taking human behavior into account.
Yeah, that's pretty much all the questions I have, unless there's anything else you wanted to touch on before we leave.
Again, really appreciate the time. I will let you go because this is one of my favorite topics, and given free reign, I could keep talking about it all day. So,
all right, well, enjoy the rest of RSA, and thanks for stopping by.
Thanks. Always a pleasure.
The Cyber Chat podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact of their business, and proactively address threats head-on. For a weekly recap of important cybercrime news, check out Surfwatch Labs' other podcast, the Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup. And for more information on cyber risk intelligence, check out surfwatchlabs.com.